Hi everyone, I'm Frank, Head of EMEA Marketing at Dotdigital. Thank you for joining me today for the webinar, What Will Replace GDPR? New Privacy and Data Regulations. So the DPDI bill is currently going through Parliament and is expected to be passed later this year. This bill brings in significant changes to the UK's data protection regime post-Brexit, impacting UK GDPR, privacy and electronic communications regulations, and the Data Protection Act from 2018. Today, we're going to cover how the new regime can help grow your business, fostering innovation while maintaining high privacy standards, and the implications for all marketers. But before we start, just for those that don't know, Dotdigital is a customer experience and data platform, or CXDP. So we specialize in crafting scalable customer experiences that engage and convert, all driven by powerful data. If you're looking for hyper-personalization, real-time connections, and a vast channel reach, that's where Dotdigital comes in. We talk a lot about data at Dotdigital, and we certainly don't take it lightly. We are committed to information security and privacy management, which is why we're both ISO 27001 and ISO 27701 certified. Gaining and maintaining these certifications helps us build trust, reduce risks, and meet the legal and regulatory requirements related to information security and data protection, all to help our customers navigate safely. So that brings us to today's webinar. So shortly, I'm going to share a recording of a session that Chris, CEO of the DMA, held at our virtual summit in September. This session was one of the most attended by our customers, and we really started to understand how challenging it can be to navigate changes in legislation and other regulations. So that's why we've decided to rebroadcast the session to help assist as many marketers as possible. So since it's recorded, we can't take live questions, but you can still submit your questions for Chris and the DMA via the chat function and question function. At the end of today's session, we'll provide a way for you to request more information, so please stay tuned. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Chris.
Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to this afternoon's talk on the new Data Protection and Digital Information Bill. My name is Chris Combemal, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the DMA, the Data and Marketing Association, which is the UK's leading trade association for progressive marketers. We represent the industry to government. We provide a full suite of resources to improve marketing effectiveness, and we enable industry relationships through participation in councils, committees, and events. In short, we set, promote, and teach the standards that the industry should live by. Our code sits at the heart of everything we do, providing an ethical framework to guide not just our work, but the work of the industry. Over the past 2 years, the government has engaged widely with industry to develop the first major post-Brexit reforms to data protection legislation, which has resulted in the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, which has completed committee stage and is heading to third reading, and then eventually to the House of Lords and Royal Assent. Now, our approach to the consultation really reflects what we think of as the best ethos of the DMA. Everything we do is by the industry, for the industry. By taking collective feedback from our members and leveraging our relationships with the government, we have achieved important clarifications within the legislation that will enable growth and innovation while maintaining high standards of data protection and, importantly, adequacy with the EU. In fact, maintaining adequacy with the EU was the single #1 imperative for our members, alongside clarifications and certainty around the use of legitimate interests as a legal basis. And we believe the legislation achieves the objectives we've set out. Now, we work closely with officials since the initial consultation was published to aggregate views from across the industry and share those views with the government. As long ago as October 2021, we held a roundtable for our members alongside as many as 6 representatives from DCMS, now renamed Department of Science, Innovation, and Technology, to outline the priority areas for reform for our members. We submitted a formal consultation response, and more recently, I've chaired the DPDI Business Advisory Group for the Secretary of State, which included many important UK trade bodies such as Tech UK, Make UK, UK Finance, and quite a few others. And in fact, the bill in its current form reflects much of what our members asked for. And just to give you the government's view of what they were trying to achieve, really, the bill is intended to reduce compliance for business while providing and maintaining high levels of data protection. So they've introduced a new framework that should reduce administration and bureaucracy for small businesses. They've created clarity around the lawful basis, especially around when you can use legitimate interests, clarity and safeguarding decision-making in AI technologies, strengthening the powers of the Information Commissioner's Office, crucially unleashing more scientific research, reducing unnecessary paperwork, and more. And in actual fact, the bill itself isn't so much new legislation. It is a series of amendments to existing legislation, the UK GDPR, the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations, and the Data Protection Act. So in actual fact, to understand this bill, you have to have the new bill open and these other 3 bills open in front of you so that you can track the amendments and what they're trying to achieve. Now, as I said, the report is heading to 3rd reading. We are expecting royal assent by March 2024, and implementation then to be phased from April 2024 over the next 12 months, with some aspects coming into play immediately and others taking a bit longer, depending on how much guidance is required, especially for the ICO to revise their guidance to the country about how to implement the legislation. So this is a quick summary of everything that we're going to cover in this presentation, and we're particularly focused on what are the opportunities for marketers and what does it mean for you and your organization. So the first thing to highlight is that the legal definition of direct marketing is now being added both to GDPR and PECR to mirror the definition that's in DPA 2018. That is the communication by whatever means of advertising or marketing material which is directed to particular individuals. So personalized communication, whether that be personalized digital advertising, personalized emails, personalized direct mail, across the whole range of channels. And this, of course, I think is a wider definition than industry practitioners usually understand when we say direct marketing. In fact, one reason we changed our name to the Data and Marketing Association is that when we said direct marketing, people thought of advertising mail and telephone, and not so much new modern direct channels like email, text, social media, and so on. The most significant area we worked on was clarity around legitimate interest. So at present, processing for legitimate interest is one of 6 equal lawful bases for processing personal data. And when relying on legitimate interest as a lawful basis, organizations must demonstrate that the processing is necessary for the purpose that they're setting out and carry out a balancing test to weigh up their interest against the privacy of their customers or prospects, and balance those 2 things. Now, since the implementation of GDPR, the issue that has really developed is not so much around the legislation itself, but around the interpretation of that legislation by many lawyers, data protection officers, who really have created uncertainty by advising companies that consent was safer than LI, and that even though legitimate interest and consent are equal in the text. In fact, it's been widely believed across the UK that GDPR requires consent, even for legitimate local community activity, like community groups organizing events in their local area. And often what has happened is this has limited growth at a critical time in economic recovery without providing any additional safeguards to individual. So in this bill, clauses 5, 9, and 510 provide greater certainty to the scope of legitimate interest, and in essence clarifying that any interest that is a legal interest could be a legitimate interest, and then giving 3 concrete examples. But that's not an exhaustive list, that's just illustrative examples, of which the first one, as you'll see, is processing that is necessary for the purposes of direct marketing. And those 3 examples are drawn from the original text of GDPR, where they appeared as recitals 47, 48, and 49. And I think for many people, the third one here is particularly important: processing that is necessary for the purposes of ensuring the security of network and information systems. And of course, that extends into combating fraud and other things, which are all totally legitimate purposes of data processing. And what I wanted to highlight is that the approach the government is taking is very consistent with recital 4 of GDPR, which lays out an overarching principle or guidance as to how the text of GDPR should be implemented. And really, what is the essential point is that GDPR is risk-based and proportionate rather than prescriptive. And as an example, my favorite example, recital 4 states clearly that privacy is a fundamental right, not an absolute right, and must be balanced with other rights, such as the right to conduct a business. There is nothing more fundamental to the right to conduct a business than finding new customers and retaining existing customers. A business would not exist without new customers, or in fact, a charity without donors. And in fact, what we've built on here, as I said, is recital 47 of the original GDPR, which specified that direct marketing was a legitimate interest. And of course, it is the essential activity necessary to attract and retain customers. It is important to remember that there are further protections built into the legislation. For instance, all individuals have an unfettered right, always retain an unfettered right to opt out from any marketing by any channel by informing the company. And furthermore, they're further protected by some industry level opt-out lists, like the mailing preference service and the telephone preference service, both of which are run by the DMA. And in fact, we're the only business association to have a consumer protection division, a reflection of that customer-centric ethos of our code of conduct. Another area that our members sought improvements has been in the privacy and electronic communications regulations. The amendments to PECR are significant for data-driven marketers. So firstly, for those of you that are in the charity sector, this is particularly important because in the implementation of PECR, commercial organizations have had the opportunity to communicate to existing customers or people for whom they've been in the negotiation for a sale by email without consent using an opt-out, provided that there's an unsubscribe and other things. What this amendment to the legislation does is it extends that privilege to non-commercial organizations in relation to their donors, their volunteers, and so on, creating an even playing field between the not-for-profit charity sector and the commercial sector. Another significant area of amendment is in the area of cookies. In fact, the government's overall objective is eventually to reduce or eliminate completely the annoying pop-up banners that we know everybody finds frustrating to tick as they're going about their business online, and where we know that consent is virtually meaningless because people really, frankly, don't read the detail, don't want to read the detail, and want to just get on with doing what they're planning to do on the website they're hoping to visit. Now, this amendment, this legislation goes some way towards making that possible by removing consent requirements for a broad range of cookies, including cookies for statistical purposes, as long as those are for your own use, tracking your own customers and website visitors, and not sharing that information with anyone else. And that, of course, would cover your analytics, your website analytics, and so on. Any cookies necessary to enhance website functionality, and that would include things like shopping cart, abandoned shopping cart, and so on, security and software updates, and so on. And we think the net effect of these exemptions will be a huge benefit to websites that are not advertiser supported. So, for instance, B2B websites that don't take advertising, perhaps just corporate websites that don't take advertising, and very importantly, e-commerce sites that are transactional, whose business model is selling and delivering products to people in their homes. When those are not and do not take advertising, they should be able to no longer have to have those pop-up cookie consent banners. A great improvement to experience for customers and a reduction of cost and administrative burdens for businesses. I should note out that this legislation is also fairly well balanced. It maintains high levels of data protection for consumers. And one of the areas in which the protection's been strengthened is in privacy and electronic communications, where the level of fines have been increased to match GDPR. So in other words, up to 4% of global turnover, or 17.5 million pounds. And that's worth bearing in mind when you're looking at the electronic communications side of legislation. Further change in the accountability framework. I think a lot of this for our members comes across as apples for apples. There are some subtle difference, but for all intents and purposes, a senior responsible individual is relatively similar to a data protection officer. Assessment of high-risk processing is fairly similar to data protection impact assessments. But the big change is really for SMEs in particular, and those who are conducting or who are not conducting any high-risk processing activity should be able to exempt from all records of processing activity and free up and reduce the administrative burdens on small and micro businesses up and down the country. There are amendments to the market research provisions. In particular, for marketers, the critical thing is that the definition of scientific research has been extended to include scientific research in commercial settings, so new product developments, new service developments, innovations in new technologies, all of which should enable companies to increase productivity and innovation. There's a lot of clarifications within the pure scientific research and life sciences about how you can use onward data from one study into a future study on a similar topic when you're finding cures for cancer or other medical developments. I did want to touch base on codes of conduct, which are now established in PECR to match the codes of conduct that are established in GDPR. And for those of you that aren't familiar with this aspect of GDPR, what it really does is create co-regulation, or what we like to think of as collaborative regulation, for the first time in the history of data protection. And in Articles 40 and 41 of GDPR is established the notion that industry trade associations should draw up codes of conduct that are intended to contribute to the proper application of the regulation taking into account the specific features of the various processing sectors. So in other words, the Data and Marketing Association would be responsible for interpreting and demonstrating how GDPR applies to direct marketing using the definition that the government uses from a legal basis, and then seek approval from the ICO, and then have approval under Article 41 of an independent monitoring body, which in our case would be the Data and Marketing Commission, which has existed for many years, adjudicating against complaints on our own DMA code. And what happened back in December is the lawyers at the ICO, after we'd been working on this for about 18 months, decided that a GDPR code of conduct could not cover all of direct marketing because it could not, because of the way the legislation was written, cover issues that are under PECR, which, as we know, those electronic channels are an important part of direct marketing. So working closely with the government, with support from the ICO, there's now been an amendment to PECR that establishes the same industry codes of conduct, the same opportunity for co-regulation in PECR, and it contains what I think is the magic phrase that a code of conduct under PECR can be contained in the same document as a code of conduct under GDPR. There are some evolutions to the structure and remit of the ICO. The ICO, as many of you will know, has been a corporate sole, which means that technically full authority rests in the individual of the information commissioner and not with the organization as a whole. The governance changes will change the type of company the ICO is so that it can have the same kind of corporate structure as other top regulators in the UK, with a non-executive board of directors providing scrutiny to the work of the executive as they go about their important business. And I think there's other really important amendments to the ICO's approach that reinforce the balancing that we've been talking about between the legitimate interests and privacy. And the ICO must take into account and consider the desirability of promoting innovation and the desirability of promoting competition alongside the essential desirability of protecting privacy. So they must take a balanced view as they approach their investigations of complaints and how they interpret and provide guidance. And I'll end on talking about adequacy, because there are some people out there who are putting forward the notion that this legislation may risk adequacy with the EU. It is, as I said earlier, the most important issue for our members, the majority of whom have business within the EU. And it certainly was also the #1 issue for every other business association that participated in our business advisory group. And I'll give you an example of why, using legitimate interests, we don't think this legislation creates cause for concern. One of the things I asked my team to do, led by Jamie Cameron, my Director of Legal and Compliance, was to produce a paper for the government outlining European Court of Justice cases concerning legitimate interests for advertising and marketing from the beginning of data protection legislation back in 1995. And in every single case, every instance, the Court of Justice has consistently ruled that any interest that is a legal interest may be a legitimate interest, and that no member state may limit the scope of legitimate interests. And of course, that is contingent, and the reason we say may be a legitimate interest is the processing must be necessary to pursue the legitimate interest, which is clearly the case in direct marketing. You cannot do direct marketing, that personalized communication, without processing personal data. And the processing must be proportionate and is balanced with any risk to the individual, which we talked about earlier. And looking through the rulings, a fairly recent one, I think is particularly powerful, especially because it concerns a case related to Meta and Facebook, in which Advocate General Bobek wrote in his summary of paragraphs 122 and 123, concludes that I would agree that marketing or advertising can as such constitute a legitimate interest. And beyond that, I chair FEDMA, our European collection of 21 DMAs, and we're working through getting codes of conduct for direct marketing approved in different countries in the EU. And as an example, the Data Protection Authority in Austria has approved a very narrow code of conduct for use of third-party data for direct mail that is exclusively based on legitimate interest as the basis of processing that third-party data. In Italy, they have approval of a code of conduct for B2B data based on legitimate interests. There's an approved recently a code of conduct on telemarketing, again, heavily reliant on legitimate interests. And we are building case studies across the EU that are consistent with that European Court of Justice interpretation of legitimate interest and how it applies to advertising and marketing. And just one final word I'd like to bring in that, of course, a critical principle of data protection legislation and a cornerstone of the accountability framework is that teams are trained and aware of their responsibilities. And we do provide a wide range of training, including specific awards in GDPR and so on. And what I wanted to draw your attention to is a new opportunity. This opportunity arises because our members have told us over the last few years that skills shortages are their #1 issue. But in these very difficult, high inflation times, in the cost of living crisis, the budgets for training their teams are very, very tight. So the DMA has secured funding from the Department for Education to run 2 significant programs that we consider the twin pillars of modern progressive marketing. They are digital marketing strategy, which is a 12-week course, 1 day a week, and data strategy, analytics, and measurement, which is 1 day a week for 14 weeks. And for SME employees, whether you're a DMA member or not, the government would fund 90% of those programs, with the company paying 10%. And for larger corporates, the government will still pay 70%. So it's a terrific opportunity to build up your team skills, and very important coming up. So just in closing, I want to assure you that the DMA is going to continue to work extremely hard over the next few months to ensure that the bill passes through 3rd reading and that subsequently it's passed by the House of Lords. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much, Chris, for all of that really informative session. I hope you found it useful. Hope it will help you navigate some of the upcoming challenges and changes that are happening with the UK data regulations. As I mentioned earlier, if you'd like more information or assistance, we'll do our best to help you. So feel free to drop the Dotdigital team an email at marketing@dotdigital.com. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll be asked to complete a very short 4-question survey where you can specifically indicate if you'd like to be connected directly with the DMA. We'll also send a recording of this webinar out and put it into your inboxes from tomorrow, so you can share with colleagues who may have missed it or go back for reference later down the line. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you again very soon.